Coming up in today's video, we check out the latest of Gran Turismo 7's most hated cars. Of course, I'm talking about the Peugeot 2008. The car itself was added as part of Gran Turismo 7's very underwhelming update 1.60, and of course in today's video we're going to dive as deep as possible to see if this car really does deserve all that hate or if people are just judging a book by its cover. However, before we do get into the video itself, I'm trying to get this channel to 60,000 subscribers by the end of this year. So if you want to stay up to date with everything Gran Turismo 7 and motorsport gaming related, then feel free to leave a like, subscribe, and of course turn your notifications on. Anyway, let's get to it. So here it is in all its absolutely hideous glory, the Peugeot 2008. So of course the first thing we need to do is go ahead and check out the stats in Brand Central. So as you can see, it has a PP rating of 367.32, typically low. Now you'll notice the displacement for this thing is 1199cc. Of course this does feature the 1.2 litre PureTech engine, more on that later. As for the drivetrain, it's FF or front wheel drive, which is pretty ridiculous considering this thing looks like it should be able to go off-road, and again I'll discuss that in a bit. 129 brake horsepower, which really isn't too bad from a 1.2, pretty lightweight for its size at 1192 kg, and turbocharged. All yours for 29,000 credits. So of course the first thing I wanted to do was hot lap the Nordschleife to see roughly where this pace is at in comparison to some of the other more recent SUVs to the game. So whilst the Peugeot is performing its hot lap, let's go ahead and discuss why players hate this thing so much. And well, we'll get the obvious thing out the way and done with first, the fact it's an SUV. You'll probably know if you've been around Gran Turismo 7 in 2025, there's the continued SUV trend. It's been something that really started in January with the Toyota and of course the crossover there. Of course then we've also had the Mazda, we've had the Honda, and of course now we've had the Peugeot. The next thing is, well, whilst it is an SUV, that isn't necessarily inherently bad in a racing game. There is things out there like a Trackhawk, of course, but this isn't. This is a Peugeot 2008 with a 1.2 litre engine, and it's an incredibly common sight on everyday roads. This is certainly no performance derivative version. It's certainly more of a type of vehicle you might nip down the shops in, or of course do the school run in, rather than throw around somewhere like the Nordschleife in a track focused racing game. Whereas this might actually work in some kind of open world game. Gran Turismo 7 of course is a closed course racing game. There is no open world. So when vehicles like this are getting added on a regular basis and we're racing around in 15+ year old GT3 spec machines, it really does feel like Polyphony are giving us a swift kick to the ball. Now of course there is a counter argument to this, and a lot of original Gran Turismo players will probably tell you, you don't know what Gran Turismo is all about. I've been playing since day one and cars like this have their place in game. And I fully tend to agree, especially when it comes to the older titles. Almost every single one of the ridiculous amount of cars that were in those games had its place, and there were some really weird and wacky everyday type vehicles there. However, this honestly isn't one. In fact, this car just shows off the worst of modern day car design. And of course, on top of that, vehicles like this getting added to GT7 is a completely different ballgame to something like the Gran Turismo 2 or of course Gran Turismo 4. Almost any type of vehicle had their places in the older titles because you could pretty much run them almost anywhere, where Gran Turismo 7 on the other hand is a massively locked off experience, meaning that vehicles like this getting added almost really cannot find their place. And of course when it came to the older titles, there was the balance of race cars and road cars, which is something that we don't necessarily see in GT7, of course especially post-launch. Something like this 2008 might not necessarily get the same amount of hate if it was balanced off by the addition of a more exciting, supercar or a race car or something like that, which of course then does show that everything has its place in Gran Turismo. But again, the balance just isn't quite there. Now of course, I can't talk about the 2008 without talking about the next incredibly awful thing about it, and that is of course the 1.2 litre PureTech engine. So the 1.2 litre PureTech engine is notorious for being incredibly unreliable, and it's probably one of the most talked about things I've seen when it comes to this car. And of course the fact, well, it's only a 1.2 litre engine, which means when it comes to GT7 upgrades, it still makes it incredibly difficult for this car to really find its place in game. So overall, it has a lot going against it. It's an SUV with one of the most notorious modern day engines. So with that out of the way, can we find any good in this car? Well, when it came to its hot lap, it actually outperformed my expectations, doing a time of 922.866, around about a second and a half back from the Honda, which just note has a lot more power than the Peugeot and four-wheel drive. And well, in terms of the Toyota, it absolutely decimated that thing. So it was at this point I wanted to try and go ahead and give the Peugeot 2008 a chance. Now of course it is a petrol vehicle, which means we can go ahead and put upgrades on the car, which will actually turn it into a bit of a different monster. So it was time to see if I could find a place for this vehicle in Gran Turismo 7, and we're going to start off once again with the completely stock version from Brand Central to see how it performs in the Sunday Cup, the quintessential starter place of any Gran Turismo title. So in the Sunday Cup it performed absolutely fine. There was really no complaints. Of course it was up against other grocery getters of the Gran Turismo 7 world, so it felt right at home. And honestly I would say it was probably one of the better Sunday Cup type vehicles when it was up against the typical AI that you see here. So honestly the Peugeot, as expected, was fine in the Sunday Cup. So that's something for it, I guess. But this got me thinking, where are other places this thing can run? Well, of course the next best thing after the Sunday Cup for the Peugeot would be the European Sunday Cup 400, which is actually the event that was advertised around the Peugeot 2008. So no complaints there, but then I started thinking about the dirt events, and the first was the World Rally Challenge, the one with 3 events, which it can actually go ahead and enter. And well, as you can see, it's a dirt tyre 700 pp, so it did struggle. But as for the main World Rally Challenge, unfortunately it cannot go ahead and enter since it's not a Group B or a racing car, and the same for Dirt Champions, Group B only for that one. However, in terms of its off-road potential, whilst it is a little bit on the slower side, once again that means you're pretty limited to custom races only. However, I will admit that it was quite a fun time just dragging this thing around in an old WRC Peugeot livery, and of course off-road tyres and that huge big rear wing. And of course that's going to give me one final version to talk about, fully upgraded. Can this car find anywhere to really race in GT7? Unfortunately not. It sits just over 600 pp, and honestly when you down tune it, it's completely useless at the WTC 600. It just doesn't have the power from that 1.2 litre which we've upgraded, and unfortunately in terms of even the higher events, once again it cannot really transform itself into a makeshift Group 4 car for the WTC 700. So really it's unfortunate that the Peugeot just kind of sits in this no man's land. So of course it might not be the most usable car in Gran Turismo 7, but can it be transformed into something that can give you driving pleasure? And I would say yes and no. Whilst it's certainly fun to throw around, unfortunately you're stuck with front wheel drive, and of course you're stuck with the 1.2 litre engine, which definitely isn't the most powerful and unfortunately does kind of let it down. At least with the Mazda, which is probably the closest comparison to this thing, it did have the performance potential to be upgraded and feel like a makeshift Group 4, where unfortunately the Peugeot just kind of sits in this no man's land, not really knowing what it wants to be, even when the upgrades are applied. However, it is unfortunate that upgrades just cannot go ahead and save the Peugeot. And when it comes to its overall performance, as you can see here from Suzuka, whilst it absolutely decimates the Honda, which was kind of obvious thanks to the fact we can actually upgrade it, it's still even slower than an upgraded Toyota Hiace van, which kind of says a lot. This is an incredibly underpowered and honestly pretty underwhelming vehicle. So are players right to hate the Peugeot 2008? Well, I would honestly say yes. Again, this is like the 4th SUV so far this year. Of course, players have made it very, very vocal that they do not want these in game, especially when it's lacking so many other incredible vehicles, and of course those outdated race cars, which is not really the balance of. Of course, it's also incredibly underpowered and really struggles to find its own place in game. So there we go. Hopefully the Peugeot will be the last of the SUV trend in Gran Turismo 7. However, I'm not going to hold my breath on that one. But let me know, maybe I'm wrong about the 2008, maybe thousands of other people are as well. Let me know what you think in the comment section down below, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care guys, peace.